going to paint one of my favorite spring summer Alberta scenes, which is a bright yellow canola field in front of a distant mountain range. And depending on how our sky goes, we might end up with some fluffy clouds or some moodier thunderstorm clouds. So we'll explore maybe through both of those. To start off, we've got our Canson mixed media sketchbook here. That same sort of brand that we use in class. I have taped my back page with a nice even border to the backboard of the sketchbook, which is going to help my paper stay a little bit flatter as I'm painting. And I'm going to be working with our Yarka 10-pan semi-moist watercolor palette. I have a couple of different brushes. So a larger round, a smaller round, a flat bright, and a regular flat. So if I had masking tape at home, you would see just that regular yellow paper tape. I do not, so we're using a different kind of paper tape called washi tape. We're going to mask off our horizon line. So right now, what I would like to create is a 2/3 canola field, 1/3 sky. So probably about right there. I'm going to tap down our tape. I've worn off a little bit of the sticky with my pant leg. And now I'm going to use additional pieces of the tape and tear them in half. And so what this does is it kind of changes the edge of the tape from that mechanical, razor, precise, sharp line to something that's a little bit more organic and torn. This is going to help us save some of the paper, save some of our whites for that imaginary mountain range. So I'm not worrying too much about what's inside of those mountains. It's more about just protecting that edge. I'll be really careful to paint only up to the edge. Poppy brought me her toy. Hopefully she doesn't bring it back. Okay, so we've got some differing heights in our mountain range there. This is going to be mountains. Underneath this tape will eventually be some of that bright yellow canola at the farthest reach, or perhaps some green foothills. And now we're going to focus on working in this top portion, which we've taped off safely for our sky. It's important when working with watercolor to save your whites. The only white you have when you're working with true watercolor is that of your paper. So we need to use techniques like resist with tape or wax, or just really selective brush control to keep the paint out of those white areas, the areas we want to stay white. For our sky, I'm going to work with a bit of a combination, some wet in wet and some gradient work. So I'm going to use clean water and my flat brush. So it's charged up with fresh water. I'm going to have a tissue in my hand, and I'm going to charge my round brush up with the blue. Okay. So just in case you don't have a crayon to work with, I'm not going to use any wax resist techniques here. That way you should have a tissue or some toilet paper at home, or use the edge of your sleeve. No, don't use the edge of your sleeve. The paint might stain your shirt. So we're going to start with our flat brush here, and I am going to add water to the whole surface, right up to the edge of my mountains. don't want it to be too wet, so I am going to blot my brush and then just kind of comb over that one more time, making sure it's even and there are no puddles. Now I'm going to start from the very top edge because that's the sky that's closest to us. And so you can see in some of our references that that is the brightest blue, the darkest blue that we're going to see. So starting at the top, I'm going to kind of go back and forth, start to maybe skip a little bit, bring in some streaks the closer I get to the mountains. And there we go. I'm going to stop with that. Now really, really fast. Touched it once in every area. For a little bit of brush control now, I'm going to go over top of it with my clean, damp, flat brush and just pull some of that blue where I want it to go. Maybe lift a little out of the center. And now we're going to go in with our tissue, and the higher in the sky, the closer above our head is where we're going to see those bigger clouds. So I'm going to pull out some of those bigger shapes towards the top edges of our page, and then bunch up my tissue a little bit smaller and pull out some narrower clouds towards the base of our mountains. Okay, I'm going to run my tissue just along the washi tape here. You can see there's a few extra bits of blue paint, and those will take a little while to dry. I don't want them to get in the way, or I don't want to smear them accidentally. So just kind of wipe those away for now, and we will let our sky dry. So some of our more developed storm clouds have those underbellies, those steely gray, almost purplish shadows. So the way we can achieve those is by using a mixing palette. So I'm just going to use the top of a yogurt container. I'm going to pull in some of the blue that we have in our sky, but I'm also going to pick up some of the black from our palette and some of the purple. Okay, so mixing all three of those together, I kind of get this little thunderhead color. Now it's always great to have a swatching paper beside you, and because you're working in your sketchbook right now, it's kind of hard to swatch in your sketchbook. So you can take a scrap piece of paper and just kind of check the color, see if that's going to work. I think it's a little too purple, so I am going to bring in just a little bit more gray, so that'll be the black. Oh, now that might be a little bit too black. Let's see. Maybe a combination of both would be what I'm looking for. So I've got my black on the surface there. I'm going to add a little bit of water, just kind of pull some of that out and divide it. And then introduce a little bit of purple, a little bit more purple to one half of it. Okay, so now I have my little black puddle and my little purple puddle, and let's work into this cloud here on the right. You need two brushes again for this technique, so I'm going to work with my round here that's got the fresh shadow color on it, and I have a second flat one that's got clean water on it. Now you can do this with a second round one. It's not a problem. It's just all in the angle that you hold your brush. So if I look at my reference images that are there on the right hand side, you can kind of see that there's those little shadow creases that exist in the middle of the cloud. And with my control brush, I'm going to kind of scrub up to the edge on the top and feather that shadow out. So, see that again? I'm working from the top area into the paint with that wet edge and feathering it out. So it softens on the top, and we don't want it to be a perfect hard edge on the bottom, so I might kind of scratch at it a little bit there and just feather out some of those other edges. Can introduce more of the shadow right along the very base here. While that's still wet, kind of pull it up into the other one. Give a few texture dry brush dapples to the top of the cloud, and perhaps we will feather it out and extend it sideways. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that to the rest of my clouds. Okay, so our sky is now complete and dry. So I'm going to take off the masking that helped me save space for our mountain shapes. To create the edge of the mountain range, I'm going to use the same shadow color. With a hard edge. And then take my flat brush and bring that shadow down into the rest of the form. Now, perhaps we want to imagine that some of these top peaks still have snow on them. So I'm going to go in right now and just sort of pick out that darkest shadow at the top edges. I don't want it to necessarily be pure white at these ones that are closest to me because they're lower. They're in altitude. They're lower, so the snow is maybe not as established. That peak back there, that one I'm definitely going to maintain the bright white on. And let's pull these ones in from this side. And they might maintain the white peak a little bit better on this guy here. Scrub that edge, soften it off towards the bottom, and then with the clean brush, also scrub it from the other direction, softening it up towards the top. Okay, back on this side, I'm going to create some rockier, sort of lower textures. Some of those darker shadows. Just kind of pull them down to fill the space. Now I'm going to go in with a little bit of a diluted shadow color, add a little more water to it, because those mountains that are farther back in the background have what we call atmospheric perspective interfering with our vision of them. So they're going to appear just paler than the ones here in the foreground do. A little bit of fuzziness happening at the overlapped edges, and that's okay because these purple shadows are what we call an underpainting. And we're going to go in with some greens and some browns and some more natural sort of earth and stone colors once everything's dry there. Okay, so we're gonna introduce some other colors onto our mixing palette. So let's wake up the brown. And we'll add a little puddle of brown. And wake up the green. Add a little puddle of green, which I'm sure we will use more of later in our foreground. Okay, so for the brown, I don't want it to be too concentrated. I'm going to dilute it here and bring in a little bit of our shadow, cooling it off a little bit, darkening it slightly. And I'm going to brush it onto our foreground mountain, or our foremost mountain, excuse me. This mountain is still in the background, but it is the closest one to us. Okay, I want to control my edges. I don't want anything to be too focused in these back mountains. They're pretty far away even still. Okay, so we'll bring in some more of that dark here to this mountain. And control those edges. Okay, at this point, I'm going to take my brush, still with the brown on it, and scoop up a little bit of green. Now that's an earthier sort of army green. Feels much better in my mountains than the bright plant green. And so I'm just going to wet and wet kind of dollop that in to the base. Starting up higher, these are trees. They're going to be a little bit narrower, maybe a little bit more sparse. And then as I go farther down the mountain, closer to the horizon, closer to the land, they're going to take over more, and they're going to appear a little bit brighter. So we can bring some of that true green into things. I feel like there should be a little bit more color in those background mountains, so just a bit, and I'm gonna draw them and drag them kind of up to the top. Not too intense, just enough to sort of feel like there's earth still happening there, as opposed to the blue and purples in the sky. Okay. Let that dry. I kind of don't like this light brown edge here at the top of this mountain. It's feeling a little odd and too close in value and color to the cloud. So I'm going to bring in those greens right to the top edge and make this mountain really clearly part of the land and not the sky. There we go. Feels a little more defined. Okay. Maybe do a little bit of dry brushing on this guy just to give him a few more tree textures. We don't want it to be too obvious, just a little bit of stippling and dry brushing. Okay. So at this point, I'm ready to move into my canola field. So I'm going to remove my horizon line tape. Really gently kind of supporting the paper with your other hand and pulling down and away from the area that you've painted. That way, if it tears, it doesn't tear off your painting. Okay, so there we go. Working from the back to the front, saving our whites, and using the techniques that make sense for our composition. We've gone through a gradient wash, we've done some tissue textures, we've controlled our edges, both hard and soft, and we've done some layering with color mixing. So this is coming along pretty well. I think what I'd like to do next is do a big flat wash of yellow as my underpainting for the canola field, because this is all going to be canola. If I had my way, I'd be standing in big old field of yellow blooms. So at this point, you've been working with some muddy colors. If you have swamp water, you're going to want to freshen it up. But if you still have a cup of relatively clean water, you can keep going. So I'm going to go with a clean brush, clean water. Yellow is a very sensitive color, so you don't want to have any sort of pollutants in your palette. If you do, if you end up with a mucky mess like this, a really easy way to clean it up is to just add a little bit of water to the surface, scrub it, kind of give it a bit of a bath, and then you can go in with a clean tissue, kind of wipe and twist the surface. You don't want to do this with a paint that has been sitting with water in it, because they're semi-moist and the water might have flown all the way through to the bottom and your Kleenex will lift the whole chunk of paint out. But if it's dirty, notice this is not the palette I've been using. This was my yellow example dirty palette. So if you've got dirt, clean your palette to start with. This green, see, it's got a little bit of blue in it. You might wish to also clean that up. So yeah, yellow's finicky. Protect it and do the best you can to keep it pure. So charge our brush, working it into the edges, making sure that our bristles are absorbing the water and the paint, and getting a nice full charge. If you don't feel like you have a steady hand, you can do some reverse masking and take that tape, if you didn't crumple it up, and put it over top of your mountains to protect them from getting too yellow canola-y. However, you do want to be careful because that tape, you see, it's got some colored paint on it. So we're going to give that a quick wipe down, make sure we don't end up with any browns in our canola field. And now time for the flat wash. Ooh, did not have enough paint on that brush for this area. So really quickly, stop and fill, introduce it back, and back and forth we go. Pulling down, filling in. I'm going to do more layers of yellow on top and green to show the plants. So right now I'm really just going for an even base coat of yellow, as even as I can get it. The larger area of flat wash, the more challenging it is to get it even. So do the best you can and try not to over scrub. This third pass here has got to be the last one I do, or my paper might start to buckle and tear and erode on me. So nice bright yellow canola field, and let's watch paint dry. So I don't know if you can see that, but the yellow paint flowed up into my mountain. not too big of a deal. I don't want to lift too much paint out, but I don't want yellow in my mountain. So I'm just going to really sort of delicately blot at it with a thirsty brush and hope that in the end it won't matter. There we go. We've got the base of our yellow canola fields, and now we're going to add in some extra textures. Okay. If you notice in our reference images there on the right, in the middle picture you can see some bigger, brighter yellow blooms in the foreground. I really want to make sure that I do preserve those for that illusion of depth. The flowers that are closer to the viewer should appear larger, should have more details than the ones that are way far off in the field. So for me, that's going to look like a combination of careful placement of my green paint and possibly a little bit of wax crayon. So I'm going to use this sort of chartreuse color. It's not truly yellow, it's a little bit green, but that's what I've got. So here in the foreground, I'm going to just kind of block in some shapes, little sorts of flower blooms and flower scribbles. For our plants, we're going to go with the green on the round brush and a little bit of water and dilution with our palette. And I think that nope, I'm in the middle of changing my mind. Well, we'll need the juicy paint for the front end here for some of those brighter flowers and leaves and things. So we'll call those shapes there the front edge of our field. To continue with our foreground, we're going to bring a little bit more green down into these front areas. A little more diluted, a little paler. And you'll notice that where I've put that crayon down, we're getting some resist. So that's good. With our thirsty, barely damp flat brush, I'm going to take that green that I just put in and I'm going to pull it downward. So you're going to see it spreads a little bit as a dry brush would, and we can blot at some of our spaces to leave some gaps where we can introduce some of that bright yellow as well. Along the front edge, we would probably see the dirt in the foreground. So we could also add in some brown. We don't need much, and it doesn't have to be pure brown. We could mix it with a little bit of the green, but just something along the front edge here to sort of delineate that this is in fact the ground, and we are as close as we can be right into that field. A little bit of softening of the edge with our clean water on the flat brush. Creates a little bit more interest and irregularity, which is what you would encounter in a farm field. Now I'm going to mix that brown into our green, creating a bit of an army shadow color. And I'm going to use the flat brush to work with that paint because it's got a very skinny edge. And I just kind of want to see some stalks. pulling up into our field, breaking up that yellow. I'm going to go back to our palette and get some fresh bright green. Add in some longer, taller lines of the fresh green, the bright green. Creating for ourselves that illusion of the leaves and the stems at the base of our canola plants. Mixing now on my palette, using up some of that other shadow color that I had to create a bit of a darker army green. I'm going to go in now with my round brush and just kind of stipple and tap to fill in some of those yellow gaps towards the bottom. And this texture will give the illusion of individual leaves on the plants and block out some of that color that we might not want to see. I'm going to follow that up with some brown stippling, fresh from the palette, kind of overlapping with some of those leaves. So we'll get a little bit of blending, a little bit of wet and wet. And it'll start to feel, you know, kind of like a little organic mess, just like the base of a field would. Introduce a little more green into our canopy, the top parts of our closest plants. I'm going to choose to use my flat brush now. Scoop up some of this miscellaneous dark marks. Separate out our bristles a little bit. And maybe need a little more color than that. So we will use our round brush, fresh from the palette. Bring in some fresh green. There's a little bit of purple left. Fresh from the palette. Little bit of fresh brown. Charge up that brush. And create those stippling textures. Starting with browns. And it's not going to be perfect, it's not going to be even. There might be some ebbs and flows in our canola ocean, higher parts and lower parts. As it gets further back, they're going to get smaller and paler, farther apart. Excuse me, closer together. Okay, I'm going to go in now with some fresh greens, kind of continue these. We might not see the greens all the way back. They might just appear here and there in the 4 to mid-ground range. Just add a little bit to change that mountain, camouflage some of that yellow that bled earlier. Okay. Turn to the side of our brush, get a bit of a different texture, a bit of verticality to some of our marks. Little bitty bits of green towards the back, paler, paler. we'll call that done. And give it a dry, and I'll take a still photograph of it and input it into this video.